Welcome to the Deep Dive, and specifically to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Friborg. Today, we're really getting into a fascinating and, I think, very practical framework in international relations theory, liberal institutionalism.
Yeah, that's right. We're looking at the work of scholars like Robert Keohane, Joseph Nye, trying to understand something quite fundamental, really. How do countries manage to cooperate? I mean, complex, sustained cooperation, even when there's no big global power, no hegemon, making sure everyone plays nice.
And that's the key shift, isn't it? The idea that stability can actually stick around after a superpower maybe starts to fade. It makes this theory incredibly relevant for, well, for actual policy today.
Yeah.
It sort of translates the abstract theory into something you can use for diplomacy, especially when you look at huge cooperative projects like the EU, for example.
Absolutely. And we're going to try and unpack exactly how these international regimes, these institutions, actually function. What are the mechanisms they use? How do they nudge self-interested states towards cooperation? And we'll bring it right down to earth with a look at institutional capacity building, specifically in the European context.
Okay, sounds great. But before we dive deep, just a quick reminder for everyone listening. If you find these discussions valuable, the research and analysis we put in, you can actually help keep it all going. You can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a small monthly fee, helps us out. And you get access to extra episodes too. The link's always there in the description.
Okay, so foundations first. Liberal institutionalism, sometimes called institutional liberalism or neoliberalism, though that term gets used differently elsewhere too. It's often framed as the maybe more optimistic view in IR theory. What's its core claim about how the world works?
Well, fundamentally, it's saying cooperation isn't just, a temporary thing, a fluke between wars. It argues it's possible and, more importantly, sustainable, that it can actually reduce conflict and competition in the long run.
Right, which is a stark contrast to neorealism. Neorealism tends to look out, see anarchy, everyone scrambling for power, for relative gains. It's pretty skeptical about lasting peace. Liberal institutionalists say, hold on, these institutions, these regimes, they're crucial. They act as intermediaries. They actually change the game, change the incentives for states, making cooperation seem, well, rational.
And the big name here, you mentioned him, is Robert Keohane, especially his 1984 book, After Hegemony. That book took direct aim at hegemonic stability theory, the idea that you need a dominant power, a boss, to keep order. Keohane argued, no, actually, stable international systems can survive even without that single top dog.
Exactly. His argument was that institutions, even if they're not perfect, they develop a kind of inertia, a life of their own. They don't just vanish when the power that set them up declines. And then he and Joseph Nye, in Power and Interdependence, pushed things even further. They argued that, well, the very nature of international politics had fundamentally shifted.
Right. This is where we get beyond that sort of traditional view of states as billiard balls, the Westphalian system.
Yeah.
Keohane and I said, look, international politics is woven together through multiple channels, not just formal diplomatic notes between capitals. This is their complex interdependence framework.
Precisely. And they identified three key types of channels that really define modern global politics. First, the one everyone knows, interstate relations. That's your classic government-to-government stuff.
Huh.
Ambassadors, treaties, state visits, formal conflicts, the stuff realists focus on.
But then they added two more that really blur the lines. The second one is transgovernmental relations. This happens when you drop the assumption that states always act like single, unified actors.
Yeah, think of central bankers talking to other central bankers directly, or maybe environmental agencies coordinating across borders, or intelligence services. These are parts of governments connecting with their counterparts, often bypassing the traditional foreign ministries. It's more informal, often technical.
And the third channel, transnational relations, is even broader. Here, we drop the assumption that states are the only actors that matter. So this includes multinational corporations, huge NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, scientific groups sharing research, even, global social movements or criminal networks. It means, say, Google negotiating with the EU Commission is just as much a part of international politics as a UN resolution.
So if the world is defined by this complex interdependence, especially, they argued, among developed democracies, what does that world look like? They outlined three main features. First, those multiple channels we just talked about, connecting societies at many levels.
Second, the agenda of international politics is constantly shifting. There's no fixed hierarchy where military security is always number one. Suddenly, a financial crisis hits, or a pandemic, or climate change. And those issues can dominate everything, completely blurring what's domestic and what's foreign.
And the third feature is perhaps the most striking. They argued that among these deeply interconnected states, using military force against each other becomes almost unthinkable, or at least incredibly costly. The economic fallout, the damage to the institutional ties, it just outweighs any potential gain.
Okay, so complex interdependence is the condition. How do states manage it? That's where international regimes come in. You define those as sets of governing arrangements, basically rules, norms, procedures that help regulate behavior and control the effects of being so interdependent.
Right, and they can be very formal, like the World Trade Organization with its detailed rule book or the Eurozone's banking union. Or they can be more implicit, almost like unwritten rules. Think about the long-standing norms governing maritime navigation, for instance.
But that brings up the million-dollar question, the one realists always ask. Why? Why would states, which are fundamentally self-interested, agree to be constrained by these rules and institutions? What's in it for them? What's the functional logic?
It really boils down to solving collective problems that states can't fix on their own. The idea, sometimes called rational anticipation functionalism, is basically that states create institutions because they rationally expect them to deliver benefits. Often, it's about fixing what you might call political market failures.
Political market failures.
Okay.
Simplifying that means there's some flaw in the system, maybe lack of trust or poor information, that stops states from making deals that would actually benefit everyone. And the institution is like the mechanic fixing that.
Exactly. Keohane laid out several specific ways institutions do this, but we can group them. One major function is tackling the information and trust problem.
Okay, how? How do they build trust?
Well, they provide reliable information. They make it easier for states to signal their intentions clearly. This helps overcome issues like asymmetric information, where one side knows more than the other, leading to suspicion. Think of the lemons problem in economics. Institutions create transparency. They also make commitments more believable, more credible, because promises are made publicly, often within a standardized framework. There are reputational costs to breaking rules everyone sees.
So they basically shine a spotlight, making it harder to cheat and rewarding honesty.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the other main function?
The other big one is solving the time and transaction cost problem. Institutions make it cheaper and easier to make legitimate agreements. They provide ready-made forums, rules, procedures. Think about the WTO again. If you want to negotiate a trade deal, the framework is already there. It lowers the cost. But, crucially, they also increase the cost of breaking the rules, of illegitimate actions. If you're in the WTO and you just slap on a tariff unilaterally, the institution provides a legitimate pathway for other states to retaliate. It raises the cost of cheating.
And part of that is extending the shadow of the future, right? That's classic game theory. If you know you're going to be interacting with the same states again and again, tomorrow, next year, in 10 years, you're more likely to cooperate today because you want them to cooperate with you later.
Precisely. It encourages reciprocity. I follow the rules now, expecting you'll do the same down the line. It shifts the calculation from a one-off interaction where cheating might pay to an ongoing relationship where cooperation is usually the better long-term strategy.
And what's really interesting is how durable these institutions often are. John Eikenberry wrote a lot about this. Even if the power that created them fades, the institutions themselves often stick around. Why is that?
Well, think about the sheer effort, the startup costs involved in creating something like the UN or the Bretton Woods system. It takes immense political capital. Once they exist, they immediately start shaping expectations about how states will behave in the future. That predictability itself becomes valuable.
And they build up bureaucratic momentum. Routines, procedures, entire careers are built around them. Think of all the people working within the WHO or the IMF.
Exactly. That creates inertia. Plus, you get spillovers. Cooperating in one area, say trade, often creates the need to cooperate in related areas like finance or environmental standards. And trying to build a competing institution from scratch faces enormous hurdles. It's usually easier, even for dissatisfied states, to try and reform the existing regime rather than tear it down and start over. The costs are just too high.
Okay, so if institutions are supposed to make cooperation easier, transfer knowledge, build capacity, can we see this actually working? A concrete example of a regime changing how states operate. Especially thinking about our listeners interested in Europe, and perhaps Danish politics within that, the EU's twinning program seems like a perfect case study.
Oh, absolutely. Twinning is a fantastic real-world example of this kind of deep institutional cooperation and capacity building. The EU uses it a lot in its external assistance programs, especially for countries hoping to join the EU under the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance, or IPA.
And this isn't just about sending money, is it? It sounds much more hands-on. It's like a direct transfer of, well, administrative know-how, almost like DNA. What does twinning specifically aim to do?
The goal is incredibly specific, very results-oriented. It's designed to help the public administrations in these candidate countries actually adopt, implement, and enforce the massive body of EU law and standards, the acquis communautaire, or EU written, as it's often termed. It's about building their capacity to function like an EU member state before they even join.
So you literally have, say, Danish civil servants or German or French working side by side with counterparts in maybe Albania or Ukraine, sharing best practices, embedding EU procedures, building long-term relationships between administrations.
Exactly that. It's about sharing good practice to help reform their public administration, yes, but also building those working relationships for the future. It smooths the path to integration. Twinning uses the institutional weight and expertise of the EU system to make the candidates' commitment to reform credible, while actively shaping their internal structures to align with the EU regime. It's liberal institutionalism in action, really.
Right. Let's bring power back into the picture. We've talked about interdependence, institutions, but how does power operate in this kind of world, especially now with the information revolution slashing communication costs? Has the nature of power itself changed?
Nye argued strongly that it has. The rise of complex interdependence, turbocharged by instantaneous global communication, has definitely increased the importance of what he called soft power. That's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion. Setting the agenda, shaping preferences, establishing norms, that becomes much more important relative to traditional hard power, military might, or economic sanctions.
And in this world, absolutely flooded with information, just constant noise, what becomes really valuable? You mentioned credibility earlier.
Credibility becomes a absolutely critical power resource. In an environment where anyone can broadcast anything, being seen as a reliable, truthful source of information is incredibly powerful. Think about organizations that are seen as open, transparent, maybe international in scope, providing coherent, unbiased information. The IPCC on climate change is a classic example. Its influence comes not from armies, but from the perceived credibility of its scientific peer-reviewed process.
Okay, but Keohane and Nye also drill down into the nuances of power within interdependence. They made this really crucial distinction, one that policymakers sometimes miss, between sensitivity and vulnerability.
Yes, and this is vital for actual strategy. Sensitivity is about how quickly and how much policy changes in one country impact another within the existing set of rules. So if country A raises interest rates, how immediately does that cause pain for country B's economy? That sensitivity, it measures the immediate impact, assuming the basic relationship stays the same.
Okay, so that's the immediate shock. What's vulnerability then?
Vulnerability is the strategic dimension. It's about the costs of actually changing the relationship itself, of finding alternatives. How costly would it be for country B to decouple its economy, find new markets, or develop alternative policies if country A keeps doing things that hurt it? That's vulnerability. It reflects the deeper structural dependence.
Let's try an example, maybe energy. If Germany is highly sensitive to Russian gas price hikes because it relies on it day to day.
Right, that's sensitivity, immediate impact.
But if Germany can, over a year or two, build LNG terminals, switch to renewables, find other suppliers, its vulnerability might actually be much lower than its sensitivity suggests.
Exactly. Germany might feel the pain short-term sensitivity, but if it has viable options to change the situation long-term, low vulnerability, then Russia's leverage is limited. This leads to a really important policy insight. Focusing just on manipulating sensitivity like short-term trade spats without considering the underlying vulnerability is often a losing strategy. You need to assess the deeper costs of exit for the other side.
So the real durable power in an interdependent relationship comes from asymmetries and vulnerability. Who needs the relationship more? Who has fewer outside options?
That's the core argument. Asymmetrical vulnerability is where the strategic leverage really lies.
Well, this has been a fantastic tour through liberal institutionalism. It really offers a robust way to understand how global cooperation actually happens, even in our messy world. It shows that these international regimes, even the imperfect ones we have, are pretty essential. They reduce uncertainty, they help manage all this complexity, and they do actually constrain how states behave.
Absolutely. It reminds us that just counting tanks or looking at GDP doesn't give you the full picture anymore. The sheer complexity of global connections means you have to dig deeper. To really understand where conflict or cooperation might happen next, you need to look beyond just those hard resources and analyze those specific patterns of asymmetrical vulnerability. Who depends on whom, for what, and how costly would it be to change that?
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe a bit provocative, for you, the listener, to chew on. Tying back to institutions and vulnerability, could a state ever intentionally make itself more sensitive in one area, say, by deeply integrating into a powerful bloc like the EU, accepting its rules and dependencies precisely to reduce its vulnerability in another area, like long-term security or economic stability?
It's an interesting question. It suggests that sometimes giving up some short-term freedom of action, tying your own hands within an institution, might actually be the smartest way to secure your deeper long-term interests and reduce your exposure to bigger risks.
Food for thought indeed. A great deep dive. Thank you for joining us for this look at international theory. And if you enjoyed this exploration, please do follow the podcast. And if you could rate it 5 stars, that really helps us reach more people who are interested in international affairs and, the dynamics of global governance. Thanks for listening.